Support for this program comes from Jazz on the Tube, the internet's largest collection of free streamable classic jazz videos. From Miles Davis to Louis Armstrong, from Thelonious Monk to Duke Ellington. You'll find it all on jazzonthetube.com. Start your free subscription today.
Hi, and welcome to Jazz Talk, a Jazz on the Tube podcast. My name is Ken McCarthy, and this is where we talk with people who are doing important work that supports and illuminates the music we love. The writers, the scholars, the educators, the filmmakers, the producers, and more.
Hi, this is Ken McCarthy with Jazz on the Tube, and this is our third interview with Al Jackson. It's the most interviewed person on Jazz on the Tube, and good reason for that. We did one fantastic interview about Louis Armstrong. We did another one about the Petit Treme Jazz Museum, which everybody should visit when they go to New Orleans. And today I have a new idea that I'm going to try out on Al. He's my first subject. I hope he'll like it. You know, we talk about music and we talk about the musicians, obviously, and sometimes we talk about the producers and the museum owners and the operators and the writers, and that's good. But we kind of talk about it in a vacuum. And here's what I mean by that. The environment of music is ever changing. I mean, it's becoming obvious now. For instance, today you can hardly find any new records. Well, you can't hardly find any new records at all. Everything's streamed. So that's a radical change in the way music is being shared with people. I mean, really radical. It really changes everything. And, when I was just reading a book about jukeboxes. Now, I was born in 1959. So when I saw jukeboxes, they were already novel. They were sort of semi-novelty pieces. But I'm reading this book, and jukeboxes were it at a certain point in musical history. A lot of people didn't have a record player at home. And there were certain records they weren't allowed to play at home if they did. Right? So I think what I want to do now is talk with people who are a different age than me, and also lived in a different environment. I'm half suburban, half urban. So for a little bit of time, I lived in the Bronx in a real neighborhood. But most of the time I lived in a suburban wasteland where you never talked to your neighbors and nothing was going on. It was a very strange kind of environment compared to the city. Anyway, I'm sort of rambling here, but today we're talking with Al Jackson, and I want to talk with someone who was born in 1943, who came of age. Is that right? It's the right year, right?
Absolutely. 80 and 2.5 weeks.
Okay, I know. That's one of the reasons I want to do this call. So I want to talk with someone who was born in 1943. That means they came of age in the middle 50s.
Yep.
And they started their adult life in the 60s. Now, for those of us, I was born in 59, so I have no idea what was going on until, the 70s or 80s. But when I talk to, quote, well, now I talk about young people all the time. When I talk to young people, I try to explain what New York City was like in the 70s. Musically. And I said, well, we could hear the Talking Heads one day, and then the next day we could hear Tito Puente do a free concert in the park, Central Park, and their heads are exploding. And I'm like, it was no big deal. That was just a day in the life of somebody growing up in New York City in the 70s. So Al, I want to know what it was like growing up in New Orleans in the 50s and 60s. But before I go there, I want to ask, what's your full name? Your full name is Alvin
Jackson.
Do you have a middle name?
I don't use, yes, but I don't use it as Pedro.
It's Pedro. Because I want to get to this. If you've spent time in New Orleans, what I'm about to tell you is not news. If you don't know anything about New Orleans, you're going to learn something new. There is a lot of Central American and Honduran influence in the city of New Orleans. There's a lot of people from that part of the world. And I think Al, you've got ancestry in that.
Yeah, from on both sides of the marriage lineage. One side from, Honduras. One side Cuba, Nicaragua, and all kind of became connected thanks to United Fruit and the standard fruit, bananas.
Okay, so you are a product of bananas.
Yeah, right. Which I love.
I do too. And of course, the great club Tipitina's was once a banana warehouse.
Back in the old days, exactly. 1 block from the river.
Yeah. Yeah, and New Orleans, people, now Florida is a big deal, but Florida only really started to come into its own in the 60s. But before that, New Orleans was the king of all communication with the southern part of the hemisphere.
And we had a very unique connection that most folk, even today, really don't think about, don't talk about sporadically. But when here's an example of how traveling really can expand your parameters beyond the wildest imagination. So I decided to spend New Year's Eve of 2021, no, 2022, excuse me, in Panama.
Oh,
And like most folk, I'm not really bound by tourist attractions, but I respect tourist attractions. It's a way that the municipality can make money. So I will make my fair share of contribution. To me, let's go the economy. I speak the language. Let's go local, right? So I decided to visit the Panama Canal and its famous locks, just for myself to compare the Panama Canal versus our own industrial canal and our locks. But Ken, as I walked up those stairs, the winding staircase, got to the top floor where there's an exhibition of the pumps and all the mechanism, but there's also a wall there. There's also a wall with pictures of the men who were behind the idea of the Panama Canal. First bloody picture I saw was a guy by the name of de Lesseps. And I stopped in my track. I said, oh my God, our former mayor's people, de Lesseps, Chet Morrison. And he was Chet Morrison, our former mayor from the 1950s, great-great-grandfather.
wow.
That was like, oh my God, just connected a real dot.
That's a big one, actually.
I'm like, wow. And no one talks about that.
Yeah, and I imagine when they were mustering people to go down to Panama to do the work, they must have all come out of New Orleans. There was no Florida really to speak of in those days.
Jamaica as well. Jamaica as well.
And Jamaica, the country.
Yeah, the country of Jamaica. And we cannot forget the Chinese.
Okay.
Indentured servants. That attitude changed recently, but there's a very strong Chinese presence in Panama City, including a monument. And the music is still blended culture. Yeah.
And it sounds like at least one of the engineers and visionaries behind the canal came out of New Orleans.
Out of France.
Out of France. Oh.
Yeah, out of France. He was a French engineer. French Spanish, I looked at him with his olive complexion and said, boy, I know you're from Malaga, Spain, but that's okay. We'll let you ride with that one. But yeah, and de Lesseps was no different. He had this undertone tint to his complexion. And of course, he became the head of the Organization of Latin American States. And unfortunately, after his mayorship ended, that was his new position, and he died in a plane crash in Mexico.
Oh, really?
Yeah, but he was a visionary.
Wow. Wow, okay.
Yeah, he was doing things in the city during the 1950s before segregation ended that raised eyebrows.
Okay.
Yeah, like musicians playing on Bourbon Street. And with the complaint, they could come to his office and say, Mr. Mayor, this guy didn't pay me. Such and such happened. And he would have his committee address it.
Really?
Yes, sir.
Wow. And this was in the 1950s.
1950s. Now, but bear in mind, I was in my single digits. But once I became the owner of a good bit of the records from Local 496, the Negro Musicians Union, a lot of information came clear because I've got the letters, I've got the documentation to support what I'm saying.
Oh, wow. This is an important piece of history. Let me make a note of that. Make sure we get back to that. Now you speak Spanish fluently. Did you learn it at home?
Yeah, and in college.
In college, you studied it well as well.
Yeah.
Now, just as a trivia point, I think Michael White is also a Spanish speaker. Is that correct?
Yeah. Michael has a PhD in Spanish.
Now, do you happen to know what his connection to Spanish is? Just something he loved, or does he also have a family connection?
It could very well be a combination because on Michael's mom's side is more French Spanish as opposed to Michael White. I call him Miguel Blanco. Makes him smile. You know? Michael White.
I'm going to do that next time I see him. Yo, Blanco.
He and Don Baffy are cousins.
Oh, okay.
Banjo's guitarist.
Okay.
And
Okay.
Michael has earned a PhD in Spanish.
Gotcha. So just wanted, and you were both educated. You were an educator as well.
Yeah, not for long. The young people are a little bit, especially the young girls, a little bit too much for the old man. I said, "Nope, I'm out of here. I've got 3 notice. I'm gone."
I had that experience myself. I thought I'd be a teacher, and I got a temporary teaching job at a community college, which I loved. I loved the students. I was teaching remedial reading. It was interesting. I was teaching remedial reading to guys that had been in and gone through the Navy and had still not learned how to read.
Wow.
But I loved working with them, and they were great. But what I didn't like was the system on top of all of us. God, I just wanted to teach them, and they said, no, they've got to go through these particular books, and they have to click off these particular check boxes. I'm like, but that's not how they're going to learn.
No, not at
all. So I couldn't, I just couldn't do it, but I enjoyed the experience. It was an important thing to do. How did, I'm so curious about this Honduran and Cuban, and what's the other one? Nicaraguan roots. How did they show up in your life besides speaking Spanish? Imagine food.
Oh yeah, I grew up on black beans and plantains, and my kids love them today. So I have my own little private, right behind the museum, there's a vacant lot. So I planted my own banana trees, my own plantain trees. So I never have to go to the market to buy plantains during the season. I just go outside with my machete, whack, come back and put on some machito, tito, more, and eggs revuelto, scrambled eggs, some sour cream, and a crema fresca, and I'm good. I'm good to go.
Oh, wow. You're making me hungry.
I'm good to
go. What time of year should I come down to get a sample of that?
The homegrown plants, the best time of year would be October.
Oh.
And that's with the assumption that we have not had any significant heavy rainfall and or tropical storms, because they tend to blow the trees over.
Oh, okay.
Trees are full of water, so they're fragile.
Okay.
More than that, I'm watching some come into fruition as we speak.
Okay. What kind of music were you listening to or hearing from that side of your family?
It was a blending, because remember, the idea was to assimilate, but maintain enough percentage of where your people really came from, so that your kids would know. But it was about, so we listened to all sorts of music, from early Puerto Rican music, Cuban music, not much African, because African music was not pushed in the country, in the city, no, the state back then as much as it is now. And of course, rock and roll is living across the street from Dookie Chase, the restaurant. All the rock and roll guys were in and out of them. So we were just from across the street in an old housing project, like, look at Fats Domino, look at Little Richard, look at Rich Owens. So these guys, and of course, our uncle was Maurice Justin, who was a saxophonist, clarinetist with Duke Dejon, with Olympia Brass Band, from whom I received my first clarinet. So we had all sorts of musical connectivity in and out of the house, in the neighborhood.
Wow.
Best neighborhood to have grown up in.
Yeah, I think with the African music, I don't even think that was even available in the United States until the 60s in any kind of numbers at all. And even then, I remember playing a lot of African music in the 80s, early 80s, and my friends being, oh, wow, that's really great. Like they'd never heard it before.
My first real exposure to West African music was when I joined the military, Air Force, and went on base, the PBX like that. and saw an album of all things, right? Frisbees today. Baba Tunji Olatunji. Esabo Kowaya Kelo Kadi. Still remember it, like, wow, I gotta buy this one, man. That was my introduction, 1962.
I think he was the breakout artist for African music in the United States. I think he was the guy that put it on the map.
He was. And didn't realize that Baba means father, a father figure. But we all tended to run it off, Baba Tunji, and now under Baba Tunji Olatunji. We live and learn. You know?
Wait, so you heard like some of the family music on records, you know, some Cuban music and early Puerto Rican music, early more Puerto Rican sides, and then of course the food. Let's go now, and you actually already started on this. Let's go now to your teenage years. So you say you grew up across the street from Dooky Chase?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, 2326 Orleans Avenue, and Dooky Chase is located at 2301 Orleans Avenue.
Wow. So, yeah. And you're not being metaphorical. You literally saw Fats Domino and all these guys wandering around.
Absolutely. Actually, my uncle, my mom's brother, had a relationship with those guys, and I do remember becoming a songwriter. Right, I was under 16 because that was after was another world for me. I remember having penned some lyrics and gave them to my uncle. I said, "Hey man, Uncle Milton, show this to Fats Domino." I would swear even today that I've heard my lyrics in one of those songs.
Really?
Yeah. I can't prove it, but in my mind, I heard my lyrics in one of Fats Domino's songs.
Do you happen to recall the lyric offhand?
And it was over 65 years ago.
Yeah, that's a lot. I can't even remember 65 weeks ago.
I poured a lot of mojitos in between. You know?
Yeah, exactly. Wow. So and I assume you heard the music pouring out.
Oh, absolutely, because Dooky always had live music as well. Dooky, the proprietor's son, Little Dooky, was also a big band leader, was a trumpet player as well. Wow. So there was always music. Ken, hold on one sec. My air conditioner's coming on.
Oh, okay. No sweat.
I just turned it off. So give it a second.
Well, you know, speaking of air conditioning, I imagine there wasn't much air conditioning then, and so when they played, the doors and windows were wide open.
But not the windows, because at that time the windows were the old, what do you call them, ship windows, I call it. Kind of semi-circular ship windows.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Yeah, and I've got one on the wall from one of the old bit when Dooky Chase before the renovation. But the doors would be open as well. Front doors, two front doors on Orleans Avenue.
So you could not open those windows?
No.
They were just sort of sealed shut. Wow, but normally on a hot night, those doors would be open.
Oh, the doors would be open. Yeah.
Amazing.
And so would just come out, same cook. Oh man, some stories like I can't tell you on the air, but well, they all dead now. But Sam Cooke's girlfriend came to the restaurant, and one of our neighbors, one of my contemporaries, he said, "Oh, miss, I just saw you." And she looked at him like, "You saw me?" He said, "Yeah, I saw you at Pontchartrain Beach." And she looked at him. She said, "Yeah." Well, you've been enough times to know that we've got this great blended culture.
Yeah.
Some people may not appear to resemble their great-great-grandmother anymore.
Right.
So they could kind of meander in and out of a lot of places.
Right.
So she said, "I know where I was, but how did you get there?" I said, "That's right. Yeah, we about the same complexion." So they pass for white to go to white Pontchartrain Beach back in the old days. But that was funny.
Which raises, and we'll have to get to that, the state of things in New Orleans in the 1950s. But so we've got you're listening to music at home from a wide palette. You've got Dookie Chase and all these guys playing live right across the street, right by you. How else were you exposed to music? You mentioned that you played clarinet.
That was for a hot minute. I like most youngsters, I happened to see Pelé, and we all thought we could become footballers. That didn't work out. I shut off my clarinet though. We sit here in the museum.
Well, I think there's a world difference between only theoretically knowing what a musical instrument is and actually having worked with it, even if you didn't maybe get very far with it, because then you appreciate, wow, someone that does this well has really accomplished something.
Dr. Michael White.
There you go. There you go.
Sidney Bechet.
Yeah.
Johnny Bigard. Lorenzo Tia, who taught all of them. Achille Baquet. Jimmy Durante's Dixieland Band. The Dodds Brothers. Yeah, the list goes on. Clarinetists were profound.
And it's so interesting because you could spend all day talking about New Orleans pianists and just talk about that, and you never get to the end of it. You could spend the whole day talking about drummers, just drummers, and never get to the end of that. Trumpet players, same thing. Clarinetists, same thing. It's kind of amazing.
Yeah.
So were there things like high school dances and things like that? Or how did you guys socialize when you were kids?
Oh, sure. There were high school dances. There were Young Women Christian Association, YMCA, dances as well. There were waistline parties in certain homes.
Waistline?
Yeah, they would measure your waistline, and whatever your waistline measured, you'd have to pay. It was either a penny or a nickel for each inch in order to gain access. Not the girls. A waistline party.
Who came up with that? That's so great.
It's a great idea, though. In retrospect, it's like, wow, that's pretty cool.
And I assume live music.
No, phonograph.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah.
And what kind of music were they playing?
Rock and roll.
Rock and roll. All right, in the 50s.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Remember, we were the birthplace of rock and roll. And I guess one could say also rhythm and blues, but rock and roll specifically. Yeah. Professor Longhead, Dave Bartholomew, Fast, those guys were recording 4 years in the 1940s after Louis Jordan would Jump and Jive. 1949, these guys were recording rock and roll music in New Orleans coming into the early 50s, which then brought in Little Richard and another group of characters. So our music predates Motown by years, and clearly it predates Elvis and Pat Boone and the Beatles and the Rolling Stones by 15 years, maybe in some cases minimally. We factor in 1950, when 1949, first mention I have in black and white of Fats and Professor Longhair, and of course both pianists, and they were always competing against each other. So the constant duel for who was the better downtown pianist. And some 12, 13 years later, there's some guy named Elvis, guys, Pat Boone, and then to the 60s, the Rolling Stones and the Beatles. These guys on Tremaine, and of course, Professor Longhair, Jesse Hill, Trombone Shorty's grandfather. Those guys were playing music, man, late 40s, early 50s, and the records from the local 496 Musicians Union bears out what I'm saying to you.
Okay. Okay. So by the time you came along in the mid 50s as a teenager going to dances and stuff, it was rock and roll.
Rock and roll.
Wow.
Now, a few years later, when the proliferation of Spanish-speaking Cubans and Puerto Ricans, Central Americans began to proliferate the city, the nightclub began to pop up first on the French Quarter, Casa de los Marineros, House of the Marines, and then across Rampart Street into Treme, between St. Bernard and 3 blocks from me on Robinson and Domain. Georgina the Piojina, una cubana, a Cuban lady, had 2 nightclubs. So we knew on Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, Georgina, man, doesn't come allá. We meet you over there.
Wow. So tell me about that, because that's something I'd never heard before, that there was an influx of people from Cuba and Central America in the early 60s. Wow, into New, well, makes sense, because I mean, historically it makes sense if you're from that region and you're going to go to the U.S. One of the places you're going to think about going to is New Orleans.
Especially if you're a merchant marine.
Ah,
Once your ship dock, you gotta, how do I stay here? Well, you meet a little Creole girl, a little New Orleans girl, and you either get married or you have children. And that's what happened to many, many people. Remember, those folk, including the Indians, the Sikhs especially, they were still Pakistanis. They were not considered European. So they, by and large, lived in a colored neighborhood.
well, it's interesting. No, go ahead.
Married women, Afro-Creole women.
Yeah, you mentioned very at the beginning of our talking, you're talking about French Spanish, and a lot of people, when they think of New Orleans, they only think of the French side, which they really should be thinking of the Haitian side, but that's a whole nother story. But
Right.
but you, if you're accurate, if you understand, you're really talking about French Spanish, right? Not just French.
No, French and Spanish.
Yeah.
Anyone who tries to separate the two languages are not being true to themselves. They've got a hidden agenda.
Mm-hmm.
Without the Haitian Revolution, by and large, there'd be minimal at best of Caribbean Spanish. And when the Spaniards gave Louisiana, returned Louisiana to the French, by and large, they took off, man. Like, we're out of here. And those who were elitists went back to Spain. Some maybe might have gone to New Spain and Mexico today, but they were out of here. They left their children. So to see a family, a male with a name like Jean-Jacques Molino, that's his French-Spanish culture. It had nothing to do with the Americans because they weren't here then.
Yeah. So let's go back to this influx in the 60s and the clubs. So these were clubs that you went to, that your friends went to. What kind of music were they playing?
Today would be known as Latin American music, but to us it was Afro-Cuban music.
So because later on, I guess the 70s, somebody put the sticker salsa on that sound. Of course, that that's just an umbrella about over a whole bunch of different genres of music. But so did you guys consciously think of it as Afro-Cuban?
Absolutely.
You talked about it even in the 60s.
Absolutely. There was no Latinos back then. That's another Western construct.
Oh wow, this is really getting deep because of course it was of course it was Machito who originally, I think in the 40s, said this is Afro-Cuban music, right?
Exactly.
All right, and yeah. Now was Machito somebody on your radar back then? No. The New York scene wasn't the New York thing and the Mambo thing.
Ray Barretto was on my radar.
Okay.
Ray Barretto, I do remember. Raimundo Barreto. Yeah. And there was this homegrown relationship between those guys, even as it meandered into baseball. Orlando Cepeda, he was on Person's Tongue in the City as well. So there was and Kid Gavilan, I might be predating you now, but remember Kid Gavilan? Kid Gavilan was a boxer, Cuban.
Mm-hmm.
He was known for the bolo punch, where he would come with an uppercut straight up and hit you right underneath your jaw and knock you out.
and you wouldn't see it coming.
You wouldn't see it coming. So yeah, that and of course, as I mentioned, because those folk were not considered European, they found themselves living amongst us and marrying women from our neighborhood.
Gotcha. It's
I'm already cool with them because back home, Cubans were not as crazy today. I shouldn't say crazy. Cubans were not trying to self-identify with someone else as opposed to themselves. To the actual genealogy. They understood, I'm Afro-Cuban. I might be fair skinned, a little lighter complexion, with curly hair, but yo soy cubano, man. I'm Cuban.
Yeah, and you'll see European guys who are part of Abacoa groups, European-looking guys.
Yeah.
And yeah, it was, and you've been to Cuba several times now, yeah?
Yeah, leaving in 3 weeks. One more
Yeah,
time.
that's exciting. And you going to Oriente this time?
I'm hoping to go to Oriente.
Oh,
It depends on what's going. There's things are so tough in Cuba.
I
So
know.
I hope to continue my research. I'm saying research, people, don't get it twisted. From La Habana to Santiago, because that is the crux of the culture. Santiago de Cuba. And I've got to get there.
Yeah, yeah. If I can help anyway, let me know because I want you to go so you can tell me what it's like. It's on my list too. What I understand from Cubans, it's another world. The Cubans in Havana, even Matanzas is another world, but everybody says Santiago is another entirely different world.
Remember, after the Haitian Revolution, migration, Santiago de Cuba, and Cienfuegos to recultivate sugarcane. Port-au-Prince, Santiago de Cuba, 53 miles, nautical miles separation.
Only?
That's it.
Wow, you could almost row a boat.
Absolutely.
And I bet some people had to.
Some people try to.
Wow. So tell me about the music in these clubs in the 60s in the Afro-Cuban clubs. What were you hearing? What artists? You mentioned Ray Barreto.
Yeah, apart from Tito, Pres Bravo, Machito, I'm trying to remember now how many of those guys were around.
So it was sort of the classic mambo guys then.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
And with me, when my brothers came home, oldest one, also in the Air Force, when he came home from Korea, bebop and jazz was the musical genre in the military. So I heard so much early jazz music, like early 1950s.
Mm-hmm.
I came home in 57 from Korea after spending 2 years there. So 55 to 57. And he came home with those jazz records. So I was familiar with jazz. I didn't understand it, but I'd been exposed to it. So that combined itself with the today known as Hispanic music. It was all Afro-Cuban back then. Whether it was Puerto Rican or not, it was Afro-Cuban. A misnomer. Dominican, Afro-Cuban, misnomer. But today we know better.
Yeah.
But,
so this is interesting. So the on the jazz front, even though you were in New Orleans, maybe you weren't hearing a whole lot of jazz, at least not bebop, let's say.
Bebop, because bebop was the musical genre. No one specifically called it jazz as such, even though back into the late 50s, Ellis Marsalis and Sir Kid Jordan began to identify as jazz. Ray Tyler, those guys some of whom had been involved with rock and roll, Alvin Baptiste to make the transition into early jazz, vis-a-vis the transition from rock and roll into jazz, which is just another way of restructuring and re-theorizing what you've been playing before.
Wow. So they had started as R&B players,
Yeah.
or rock and roll players, and as people that are really interested in music, who are playing a lot of it, they often end up playing jazz because that's where the great challenge is. That's where the great interest is. If once you learn the 3 chords,
right,
maybe you want to learn some more chords, you know?
Some more chords, exactly.
Wow. So that's interesting. So all those fellows started out as sort of R&B guys. Well, even Earl Palmer, he ended up playing on all the rock and roll tracks out in the 60s in LA. And of course he was on a lot of the R&B tracks in New Orleans as well.
Right. Remember the Motown sound?
Yeah.
Earl Palmer, Smokey Johnson, No, it ain't my fault. Dun, 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 dun. And Chuck Beatty, who we buried this year, 97. Those are the 3 guys who gave Barry Gordy the sound of Motown music. But those are the same guys who performed with Little Richard and Fats in the 50s.
Gotcha. And that was the sound of New Orleans when you were growing up in the 50s, was the rock and roll / R&B.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Wow.
And again, thank God, I bought the building when I did and preserved the documents. So when I tell a person, when I speak about that, I can say, you want to read the document? You want to read the contract? And you tell me who's on first, who's on second.
Well, that's great. Let's see. I want to make sure. Let me. I want to talk about the museum, but first I want to just go a little bit more into your brother. How much older was your brother than you, roughly?
One was 9 years and the other 10 years.
Oh wow. So wait. So okay. So if they okay. So this brings up a really interesting thing. So the 10 years, well, one of them was born in 33, the other was born in 34.
Yeah.
Those young fellows came into their own as bebop was dropping, as bebop was landing on the planet. And I think of people like Ornette, who was born in 1930, or Barry Harris, who was born in 1930. Because that's a very passionate time. When you're 15 years old, you're just full of energy, you're full of enthusiasm, inspiration, you're wide open. And I wish I got to find somebody that age. I'm going to have to look hard because there's not many of them around anymore. And ask what was it like when suddenly the cool music, the brand new cool music was Charlie Parker. And because we look at it in retrospect, right? We're by necessity, we're in the present. So we're looking at it in the past, and it's kind of not a museum piece, but it's now older music, or it's music from an older time. But there was a time when that music was brand new. And it was specifically brand new to a generation of teenagers who have the great, this music is the one field where somebody by 19 can already be a rocket scientist / brain surgeon in terms of accomplishment.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So your brothers, who were about 10 years older than you roughly,
yeah.
They were hearing maybe some bebop when they were in their teenagers. But this is so interesting to me because I know John Coltrane got his chance to really do some bebop work while he was in the Navy.
Yeah, that's right. He was a military guy.
Yeah. And there's a recording that somewhere floating around of him playing just straight bebop tunes. And because now bebop people go, well, that's the old music that the old guys played, they still may be cool, right? It's still cool and people still play it and people still like it. But tell me that it was revolutionary.
It was.
On a profound level, not just musically either, right?
In retrospect, it was, because it ushered in a new era and genre of music, which came out of what one might have considered, could have considered, again, a combination of classical and ragtime. Can you really improve this? Let's see how good you really are.
Mm-hmm.
So when we look at the Union records dating back to 1941 and read the list of names of those musicians who were in and out of New Orleans, 1941, this was pre-World War II. It really, really begs the question.
Okay. Let's get to that, but I just want to just see if we can expand on this a little bit more. So my understanding is pre-bebop, jazz was cast entirely as entertainment. Nobody was talking about jazz as art. I'm getting this just from books. So you'd go out and you'd hear Duke Ellington, but he wasn't being presented as, the new Tchaikovsky or the new Stravinsky. He was playing for dancers in a nightclub, which was fine. So it was an entertainment umbrella that he was under. But and maybe that was all that was permissible, right? It was okay to have somebody playing Bach, and well, that's very elevated, and that's really important stuff.
But the word permissible, that was all that was permissible.
But the beboppers said, oh, no. Our music is great music, and we're going to treat it as great music, and you're going to treat it as great music.
That's when middle 1940s into a 10-year span, 45 to 55 is when I would say those men, and the only way that they began to kind of push back for self-identification of their music and the genre as they introduced that music to the city, the state, and the country, and of course the world. Otherwise, you're right. It was just like, well, this is permissible, but don't go beyond that.
Right.
Someone said, no, that is not good enough. And let's stop calling it race music.
Right.
Let's stop identifying it as being race music.
Yeah, I mean, when did that even? I mean, I'm reading this history of jukeboxes, which is everybody who loves music should understand the history of the jukebox. And maybe you could confirm this to me. So up until they started fading out in the 60s, there were still jukeboxes around. There still are a few. But in the 40s and 50s, the jukebox was, and one article I read or book I said that it wasn't unusual for a record company for half of their entire sales to be going to fill jukeboxes.
Jukeboxes were the tool of choice, and jukeboxes played a very, as you mentioned earlier, many people could not afford a phonograph player or a record player, as we call it back in the day. So the jukebox became the tool for entertainment. Mom and dad would go to the local place like a Duck and Chase, and there was this rockola in the corner. Pop 4, 5 quarters in and dance the night away.
And they would have been listening to records produced by Cosimo Matassa.
Yeah, Cosimo Matassa.
Cosimo Matassa.
Yeah, that would have been his records that he produced on Rampart and Domain, and as well on Governor Nichols 500 block. He had 2 studios.
And he was one of the great independent. Well, it was independent record producers like Matassa who broke rock and roll, that got rock and roll out to people. It wasn't the big labels. It was all the independents, and he was the greatest of the independents in New Orleans, and one of the greatest in the history of that time.
Let me just throw this in at this point, because we collectively, not only you and I, but we in the true collective, right? We only speak of Matassa. But if we were ready to pause for a moment and raise the question, what was the name of that company again on Domain on Rampart and Domain? What was the name of the recording studio? Do you remember?
I don't know.
J&M Recording Studio.
Oh, that's interesting.
M was for Matassa.
Okay.
Who was the bloody J?
Well, that's a good question.
I cannot prove this. I think that I might not be too far off the mark. I believe that the J represented a guy by the name of Jules Kahn, K-H-N. It's a Jewish entrepreneur.
Oh, okay.
He died. He left his sons, I wouldn't say half, but pretty close to a quarter of the land in the French Quarter that he was able to acquire. So for me, it's not too far-fetched, because we both know that landsmen of the Jewish community have been very much involved in music, particularly all the music, just cut through the chase. So to me, it's very plausible that Jules Kahn could have been the J in J&M, but no one ever talked about Jules Kahn.
Interesting. Well, this resonates with this book, and I wish I had the title of it. It's a big, thick book. I can tell you that much. And I can also tell you it's a history of all the independent record companies and producers and promoters of rock and roll in the 50s. And yeah, it's a lot of Jewish fellas doing that. And the reason they were involved in it is they were locked out of things. They were locked out too. And they thought, oh, here's a space where we can work.
Yeah, and they did. They took advantage of it.
Yeah.
Chess Records, men of chess.
Yep.
Hey, you seize the moment. As the kids would say today, Miss Al, you get in where you fit in. Okay. And that's what they did. And thank God, they did, because had those guys not intervened, it might not have been a Little Richard and Tutti Frutti ready to rip it up.
Well, I wonder, because so much of life is just boils down to logistics, and if somebody weren't recording those records and pressing them and shipping them and to store, well, putting them in jukeboxes.
And we know on the jukebox companies, even today, Bally's, whatever the full name is, Belly, those are the guys with the jukeboxes. And we know that many of those guys have ancestors who came in from a little island known as Sicily.
There you go.
You get it?
I was actually reading a book. I think it was T.J. English, and he said it was actually the Italians who kind of pioneered the idea of going out to a nightclub in America. Like that just wasn't, everything had to be in, because everybody else, otherwise you're at home, you go to church, maybe your family has an event, but that's it. And it was the Italians that said, hey, we'll set up this club, we'll have music, we'll charge you to come in. Now, minor piece of trivia, my great grandfather, is that right? No. I should know my own family history better, but it's at least great, might be great. Owned a nightclub in Long Island City, which is Queens, right across from Manhattan. I don't know anything about the details. I just know one of them owned a delicatessen, which was called, interestingly, a French-Italian delicatessen, because if it was just Italian in those days, nobody would have wanted to go to it. So he had to throw the French thing in there. So somewhere in my ancient history, there's somebody that had a nightclub. I don't know how I even find that information out. But anyway, T.J. English believes that's one of the pioneering groups of the whole nightclub scene was the Sicilians in New Orleans. And that's a whole nother story. People don't realize how many Sicilians came to New Orleans.
Absolutely. And the descendants are still here. And still in control.
And I have a question about that. I don't know if anybody has the answer to this, but I think people that pay attention and ask questions about things should wonder why the Mardi Gras Indians celebrate a Sicilian Saint Day as one of their most important days of the year. That's a kind of an interesting thing that just happened there.
Well, and today most folks don't want the truth because once you're allowed to ascend a bit higher up the ladder, you would like to forget the previous life you led, where you were not really allowed to make those kind of advances. But we cannot forget that the Sicilians were considered Mediterranean. And we know where the Mediterranean is located, right? It's either North Africa or Southern Europe or Greece or Turkey. The Mediterranean, you're not European. So they were slighted once they arrived. And they understood, this is where we are. Let's make it work. But they were industrious enough to found their niche, worked close with the Jewish community, and with some of the black musicians as well, and some of the other folk who were African ancestry, but who had been so miscegenated, if you didn't know the ethnicity, they were more European than Sicilian, and some of the Hebrews were. So it brought a lot of things together that happened. And a lot of those guys owned nightclubs, but they also served for music. It became music venues where the ladies would also offer their wares. And in my opinion today, speaking of it, might have been the precursor to beer drinking, bar drinking. Bring the ladies in, and this ladies will bring men. And men will spend money just to talk to that woman. And other things happened, might have been illicit. I'm not saying that they were, but might have been, and I'm measuring my words, but a lot of nightclubs, a lot happened in the nightclub. A lot happened.
Still to this day. we have a little bar in our town, our village. It's been cleaned up since, but for a while there, I mean, it was the vice central for the whole region. Like every criminal thing that was going on was passing through that bar.
And music became a subterfuge.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. But those folk who knew what to say and to whom, they would come in and do what they needed to do, have a drink, and then leave. But the music was good because in Treme, I cannot remember all of the names from the Globe and Tony's Green Room and Little Gypsy Tea Room, San Jacinto, so many nightclubs, Seville, the Bucaré Lounge, Peck Steakhouse. Those are some of the names from back in the 50s as I was growing up in this neighborhood where there was live music. Every weekend there was live music.
This is just Treme.
That's Treme. Yeah, there was enough going on in Treme. There was no need to go across Canal Street to the Uptown place, but there was music uptown as well. But downtown, at one time, as one could have easily said, there were 20 to 30 nightclubs scattered all around.
Just in Treme.
Just in Treme, from Rampart Street going back to Broad. And Rampart starts the 1100 block. Broad ends at the 26, so that's 15 blocks, like a mile and a quarter.
Wow. It would, it'd be wonderful if somebody were to do a map and just, I have one for New York. Here's Midtown Manhattan.
Okay.
In the 50s.
Yeah. Yep. Something like that would be great.
And it's just helpful, it shows you, okay, where was the Onyx Club? Where was Bop City? Where was the Royal Roost? We know all these things from records, but we don't know the details.
And for us,
where was Birdland?
Yeah, well, where was Birdland? That's a must know.
And Birdland is still there. It's a strip club now.
Really?
Yeah, owned by the same people.
Evolution.
And up the street, speaking of all cultures coming together, literally up the street was the Palladium, which was the great Afro-Cuban dance hall, which could handle 1,000+ people.
Wow.
Hey, let's talk about dancing, because dancing seems to be a thing of the past now. Unless young people are going to raves, but they're not really dancing. They're sort of just pumping their fists. Talk about dancing, social dancing. What was people dancing when you were in high school?
Absolutely. Dancing the pony. You got to know how to pony like Boney Maroney. The mashed potatoes. Do the mashed potatoes. Yeah.
So there were little like dance crazes where for a little while this one dance was the one that everybody was doing.
Exactly. And some 2 or 3 months later, another craze was started. We stopped doing the pony and into the mashed potatoes.
Wow. And then of course the dream of an artist or a record company would be to write the anthem, like for Chubby Checker and the Twist.
Twist, absolutely.
And that's probably the most famous one, the Twist, that song. But you saying there were many dance craze albums or records?
Because someone would always think of new dance steps. And even when I lived in Europe, in the early part of the 1960s, I remember, of course, the Twist, needless to say, that was still hot, 61, 62, 63. But all of a sudden, I found myself back into this Spanish-speaking, Hispanic today, but Spanish-speaking environment of ba-da-da-da-da-ba-ba. Had no clue La Bamba originated on the Gulf side of Mexico, Veracruz, which was an Afro-Mexican thing.
And Earl Palmer played the drums on that from New Orleans. Yeah. on the recording, yeah.
That's interesting. That's interesting.
He could do anything. He could play anything.
1862, 63, we were dancing La Bamba in Germany.
Was that when you were in the military?
About 25, 30 minutes outside of Frankfurt.
That's a whole nother topic for somebody to write a book about. The huge role, I mean, I'm sure the military didn't intend this, but the huge role the military played in giving training opportunities to musicians and exposing, like to your brothers, for example, to bebop.
Yeah. But given the advantage, not necessarily an advantage, but the opportunity to hone one's skill as a musician in the military and get paid while doing so, and being able to perform on the local economy, because those guys who are entrepreneurs, like, man, just come and play. There's no need to speak German or French or Italian. Play the music, and that's what many of them did.
Mm. Well, here's a tidbit for your museum that you may already have known. but there is a big military base between Liverpool and Manchester in England. And of course,
Okay.
Liverpool, of course, is the dock, for the docks, which took in all the cotton, and then they put it on canals up to Manchester, where they made the finished cotton. And it was quite a weapon, this cotton business, because England at one point controlled 80% of all the world's finished cotton.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
And
That's
yeah, and if you think about it, it used to be people would grow their own food, they'd build their own houses, and they'd have the loom. I mean, I know people in Guatemala, their moms can still sit down and whip up cloth out of thin air, So that gives a local economy a sort of three leg stability. We can feed ourselves, we can house ourselves, we can clothe ourselves. So when the British Empire came in and mass produced cloth and was able to deliver it to places like India for way less than anybody could do by hand, that just wrecked vast swaths of the economy. You may have seen that picture of Gandhi sitting reading a book, and there's a spinning wheel in the background. If you think about it, you've seen that picture, an old spinning wheel. You've seen that picture, and if not, you'll certainly stumble on it sometime. And he had a quote that said, "If you want freedom, spin the wheel." And I thought that, when I first heard that, I thought that was some metaphorical, mystical, metaphysical thing. No, he was being literal. We have to get back to making our own cloth. But anyway, I'm going off on a super tangent. Because that military base was between Liverpool and Manchester, that's where the girls would go to, the local girls would go to for parties. And of course, the guys would try to come along, and sometimes they did. What music were they listening to in the 1950s in Liverpool and Manchester? New Orleans rock and roll and rhythm and blues.
And gospel.
And gospel, sure. And that's why we have the Beatles. Because have you ever been to Liverpool?
No. I've only been to London one time, and it was in March of this year.
Well, I've been to Liverpool, and I even went with a guy that was born and raised in Liverpool. And there's nothing spiritually uplifting about Liverpool. It's a port city. It's seen better days. It's kind of rough around the edges. And then you think, well, where did these Beatles come from? How did that happen? Well, because there were records from New Orleans pouring into Liverpool. And there were over 100 bands trying to emulate New Orleans kind of music. So Beatles were like the top of the pyramid. They you just see the tip of the iceberg. There were 100 bands trying to do that, take the New Orleans music and make it popular for the local audience. So
and the Beatles were successful in so doing.
Oh, for sure.
Had an opportunity, I think 1961, 62 or somewhere thereabouts, to have seen the Beatles in Frankfurt.
Wow. You did?
I was in Europe then.
Wow.
They were not as famous back then as they eventually became.
I'm sure they weren't. I've been reading a lot about them lately, and one thing that comes through clear is they had a work ethic. They may have presented themselves as sort of devil-may-care, flippant, fooling around guys, but apparently nobody worked and rehearsed, and they earned a degree of what they got. I want to ask this question. So you were in New Orleans, or no, actually you were already a grown man out in the world in the military. I just wonder, what impact did the Beatles and things like that have on New Orleans? Did it have any at all? Were people listening to the Beatles and saying, "Oh, that's pretty good"?
Well, from my appreciation of what I was told, when the Beatles came to visit, of course, City Park Stadium was sold out, but primarily children of European descent. But from what the old timers have said, and no one has refuted, when they arrived, they told the promoters, "We need to meet Fats Domino."
Oh yeah.
1963. Segregation. And they were brought down to his house in Lower Ninth Ward on Caffin Avenue, and met Fats Domino and said, "Man, we're playing your music. We need to meet you. Forget about this dumb stuff." And that was a good thing.
Have you ever seen that picture when they met?
No.
Oh, I'll send it to you.
Hey, super.
And it looks like a bunch of boys in awe of their, some superstar guy. Like
But they were. But he was and from what I understand, he was in much of awe of them because the Beatles they were beginning to become famous.
right.
As the old timers said, fast forward, what the hell? Why they want to be? They're famous. I said, no, but you're the man.
Well, I'll tell you in this picture, it's really clear that in the minds of the Beatles, Fats Domino was the man. You can just see it in their body language. And he's being very friendly. He's there, he's friendly, he's wide open. And they're like schoolboys.
It's difficult to hang out with legends and not show it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because those old folks that they get beside yourself, like it's too much for me. I can't handle it. Yeah.
Hey, so going to some of the history, and then I want to get to the museum. Segregation in New Orleans. Now, I remember hearing stories from Dr. John that when they played at it was a club somewhere he played where they had to put a curtain down the middle.
That was common.
That was common.
Yeah.
So did you actually experience that? And were you in?
Not a curtain, but a kind of a 3-foot short wall. One side for color, the other side is for European descent.
Okay, so for young people who can't even believe this ever happened, you'd walk into a club for a night out, and someone would put a divider, dividing the club in half.
Right.
And if you were black, you went this side. If you were white, you went this side.
If you were colored, you went
colored. If you were colored, if you're
colored, you went to one side.
Gotcha. So even yeah. Amazing.
It really happened.
And people would go to jail for breaking that barrier.
Yes.
I know Dr. John went to jail for that.
It was against the city ordinance.
Wow.
The Dewdrop was closed 4 times for allowing European descent guests to come and hang out. And the Dewdrop Inn dates back to 1939. But old man Panier kept reopening. Like, you can't tell me who to serve. And he eventually stopped raiding his place.
So they'd close him down and he'd reopen and they'd close. Now, you mentioned the man's name who ran that place. What was his name?
Frank Panier.
Panier?
Panier, P-A-N-I-A. Panier.
Do you know anything about where he came from or his background? Or
New Orleans, born in New Orleans. He was, of course, I was much too young, but I met his son, Frank Jr. He and I worked in the 1960s as I was in college at the old Michoud plant. The Michoud plant is best known for being the NASA headquarters in New Orleans, where we built the Saturn I rocket, the one that put the man on the moon in 1969. And that was another life of mine. I was a test data analyst testing the rocket firing pattern, old-time Honeywell computers with the punch cards and the big Hewitt Packard, clank, 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 come out. Like you need 6 rooms to hold one computer.
right.
Now you can hold it in your hand with a cell phone.
My dad actually worked in that, and in the early '60s when I was a little baby, really, I would go to work. I would visit him at work occasionally, and yeah, it was like a vast football area room with these big boxes with these tape things that were just doing this all day.
Milo tape, big inch wide, and big old reels.
I remember this when he came home one day from work and he said, "Oh man, we're going to have cathode ray tubes." I didn't know what he was talking about. and for young people that don't know what I'm talking about, computer screens. There were no computer screens when Al was working on computers. It was all cards.
Or punch cards.
You had to somehow know what the program was based on these cards. I can't even imagine this.
Those are the beginning days, man. And when we all look back, I guess we retrospectively like, oh my God, we didn't see the opportunities in the future for this kind of craft. Those who saw it are very, very rich today.
Yeah. Well, it would have been hard to see it. My dad didn't see it. He didn't, because he'd started in that kind of computing in the late 1950s, And he didn't even get a personal computer till way past when he was retired. And he said he had to work as hard to figure that out as he had to figure out the stuff that he did in the 50s.
I understand my first one after the fact was a Commander 64K.
Okay.
Yeah, from Tandy's, worked from Tandy's.
Right. Radio Shack.
Radio Shack, right? When I finally got it to print, I said, oh my God, it's printing.
Right. So, wow. So yeah, this is a little known fact of New Orleans history, that New Orleans NASA, was it right in New Orleans or is it outside of town? Must have been outside.
Outside of town. Excuse me, outside of town between New Orleans and Slidell, but more in Orleans Parish. It wasn't Orleans Parish. So from where I am, about a 20-minute ride.
And it employed a lot of New Orleanians, of course.
A lot of New Orleans, but a lot of folk from across the lake, as far as Mississippi.
Gotcha.
Speaking from where Gulfport, for an example, Biloxi, you speak of a 90-minute drive.
But it was in Orleans Parish.
It was located in Orleans Parish, but of course NASA employed people from across from Mississippi, Alabama, and Louisiana. So Mobile is only an hour and a half drive from Orleans.
Okay.
And when you look at the amount of money they were earning, it made sense.
Sure. Now here's an interesting question. We're kind of getting into the history of data processing here, but it's part of your history and it's the history of New Orleans. There was no computer science degree.
Oh. And the military.
How did people get trained? Yeah, go ahead.
Military.
The military. Okay.
Military. Yeah.
So you learned in the Air Force.
I'm in the Air Force.
Okay.
And an older guy he and his wife kind of took me and, come on, young blood, we're going to take you on our wing. He was a computer programmer in 1961 in Germany. And I'm telling this guy, man, you've got this skill, man, this skill set. You need to leave the military and go to the civilian life. But he knew better. It wasn't time. Yeah. So, man, I'm 18 years old telling this older guy what he should be doing. Well, I saw it.
Well, that's the thing about young people, they're inexperienced but they're enthusiastic, and sometimes they do see the future.
I said, man, this will make you a lot of money. He understood the military was a place to be right now. So he gave us 20 years, spent 20 years in the Air Force. But they learned it.
At that time, that was a good call. Yeah. Yeah. Wow. Okay. So we're going all over the place. It's an interesting sidebar. Because again, everything's logistics. So there had to be a pool of trained people that already knew how to do that. Yeah. In the absence of schools.
But yeah, and yeah, it was a sidebar. But I can say there were many other guys, several other military guys, even former military guys, who also saw the opportunity. And between Wiesbaden, Paris, Frankfurt, Germany, Amsterdam, opened jazz clubs.
Mm.
Yeah, open jazz club. Like, the base was there in terms of support system. You guys in the military, 99% of you don't speak German or French or Spanish or Italian or none of the above, but you want to go out and enjoy yourself. Okay, I've got a nightclub with live music.
I was talking with Carl Berger, who recently passed away. He lives over in Woodstock, and he plays piano, and he played vibes, and he was a friend of Ornette's, and he and Ornette sort of co-founded this thing called the Creative Music Studio, which in its day was an amazing thing. They bought an old abandoned motel, so it had like 20 rooms.
Yeah.
It had a big central room, a big common room, and they had guys coming from all over the world, learning music and hanging out for weeks and months on end. And Pat Metheny was involved in it, and Jack DeJohnette was involved in it. Wow. Anyway, he was from Germany, and he still at the very end was speaking with a thick German accent. And I said, Carl, where did you learn? Because he was studying philosophy and he was studying classical piano, and I said, how did you learn this stuff? He goes, there was a military base nearby and there was a club. And he said, everybody came through. Every big name came through.
Bring the girls and the men will follow.
It's so true.
That's what happened.
It's so true. When did you get out of the military?
1967.
67. Okay. And what did you do then?
School, college. Got married in 1969. Took my then wife back to where I grew up. We're going to Germany. I want you to meet the people I used to hang out with.
Okay.
And over 45% of them was, maybe more, was still in that same area. And the guy who I mentioned, the nightclub, his name was Joseph Hunter. Former military, got out, opened this jazz club. We're in Wiesbaden, which was, again, the thermal water spot in Hessen. So we're leaving the hotel where I used to go and hang out and dance as a crazy teenager. Forgot something, went back up to the room, came downstairs, and there was Joe hitting on my wife. And I said, hey, Joe, what are you doing, man? And my nickname was Herr Fritz. A very good German speaker.
Oh, really?
Yeah. He said, Herr Fritz, was machst du here? Like, what are you doing here? I said, that's my Frau, man. He said, oh, I didn't know. It was so funny. He was still in Wiesbaden.
Wow.
Yeah, he opened the club, he was still there.
So when people, I think a lot of jazz fans are aware that a lot of musicians went over to Europe sometimes for extended periods of time. Some have never come back. One of my favorite musicians, Joseph Bowie's never come back. Lester Bowie's brother. And that tells you there has to be an infrastructure of places for them to play, where they can work, and so on.
One of the guys, and I had the pleasure of meeting his daughter here at the museum.
Oh.
2 years after that opened, she came in from Wiesbaden. Well, no, not Creolita. I said, where are you from? Germany. So I said, let me just try this out. Do you, perchance, know a guy by the name of Roberto Blanco? And she said, yeah, he's my daddy. Like, what?
Oh, wow.
Come get him, man. And he was like, I'm proud peacock. I can sit it right now as you speak, man. It gives me chill. He was Roberto's big afro, always neat, with his cashmere overcoat draped over his shoulders, and walking like a proud peacock down the street. But when he hit that bandstand with his conga drums, he was the man.
Wow.
He came active in movies in Germany and his daughter. He said, well, my dad's been married 3 times. He's still alive.
Where was he from?
From Cuba.
He was from Cuba?
Yeah, many of those guys left Cuba after the revolution.
Okay, okay.
Europe, and many, of course, were based in Spain. And from Spain, they would go to France and travel to France, Germany, Amsterdam. On the proper side of the Iron Curtain back then. But there was a demand for Cuban music.
Wow. So in addition to the influx of Cuban people into New Orleans in the 60s, of course, there was another one going into Europe.
Yeah.
Only makes sense.
Yeah. And Australia, which surprised me.
Really?
Yeah.
That's a long trip.
They've been here. And, if you're Cuban, if you're a real Cuban, and you never use the word coño, you're not Cuban. That's like the Cuban motto. And this guy, I'm from Australia, with his Australian wife. And we began to speak Spanish, and he stepped and said, coño. I said, wait a minute. The word cubano, man. He said, yeah, I was born in La Habana. I said, so you migrated to Australia.
Wow, okay.
This place has been a blessing for me. I only wish there was someone 10 years, 15 years younger than me who might have been blessed with similar kind of experience to have met folk and learn about cultures outside of the United States who could really come in and interact, because, Ken, people come in from all over, man, and to be able to speak with them on their level, their terms, speaks volumes. It really does.
Well, that's a good segue into the museum. Could you tell everybody the name of the museum and the address and it's
Sure.
yeah.
Tremes, Tremes, Petite Jazz Museum, 1500 Governor Nichols Street, corner of North Villeray or Villaire, in New Orleans, in the heart of the Treme neighborhood, 6 blocks from Bourbon Street. In case you get lost and drunk, from Bourbon Street, just walk due south and you come right to us.
Yep. Yep. So if you find yourself I think 99% of people that go to New Orleans for the first time, at least, never leave the French Quarter. But so if you're in the French Quarter and you're on Bourbon Street and just keep walking, I call it east. I don't know what the correct direction is. South. Okay. Keep walking down south, Bourbon Street. Before you leave the quarter, you'll run into Governor Nichols Street. Yeah. Make a left.
Just keep walking.
Just keep going. You'll cross Rampart.
4 blocks across Rampart.
Yeah. And there's the museum. And what are your hours these days?
10:30 until 4.
10:30 till 4. Okay.
Wednesday through Saturday.
10:30 through 4 to 4, Wednesday through Saturday. And I have had the privilege of visiting the museum twice. And one time when I arrived, once I just went to visit, but another time Al was doing, I'm just going to call it your show. I don't know what you call it. It's like a show. You like it because it's not a lecture. I didn't feel like I was being lectured to. I thought I was being, I don't know, enlightened. I was being enlightened. That's what it was entertaining, but I can't call it entertainment. And it was education, but I can't say it's education, but I can say it was enlightenment. I was getting enlightenment.
That's what it's all about. Because most folk who come to the city, they're focused on Louis Armstrong.
Which is fair enough. It's a start.
It's a start. But there is so much to the city and its musical culture that folk really, 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 really need to understand what really gave birth to New Orleans jazz. And by Joe, who the hell was involved? Who made many different groups made contributions? And can we please speak about transatlantic slave trade opposed to post-transatlantic slave trade? Begs the question. Fantastic, though. Yeah, it's a good thing.
And you've, because of your life, when you were born, where you were born, the family you were born into, the neighborhood you were born into, the fact that you've traveled to a lot of these places, down to Cuba, down to Central America, you not only have the book knowledge, but you also have the feeling of it that it is all connected. It's not a theory.
I lived it, and it was very interesting for me. For me, an example again. When I speak of the French connection from Port-au-Prince to Santiago post the Haitian Revolution, my first trip to Cuba, I'm sitting there with my kids, we're trying to decide, where should we eat? Well, let's find a telephone directory. And I'm looking at this restaurant, Union Française. Like, wait a minute, French Union? What's up with that? Hey, dummy, Haitian Revolution, into Cuba, French-speaking people. Still in existence today, Union Française. Great restaurant, inexpensive food as well, but very good. So if you go back, Union Française in Havana.
Wow. Okay. Yeah, there you go. There's one example. Yeah, so many French names, so many French surnames in Cuba.
Yeah, from Haiti.
Yeah.
Sugarcane.
So it's a deep, rich, I mean, and people say this, but I think they don't realize how deep and they don't realize how rich and they don't realize how multivariate. Now you acquired with a partner, I forget the details of this. You acquired a building that used to be part of the Musicians Union.
Yeah, actually it was the home of the local Negro Musicians Union, Local 496, building which was purchased by these men in 1947. Paid for it 3 years later.
And then the union combined, and then that building became redundant.
Well, I don't know if redundant is a good word, but the building became disoccupied.
Okay.
But a lot of the documents, a good bit of the documents which had not been taken prior over the 18-year span when the building was abandoned, had been abandoned, were still inside of the building. And I was fortunate enough, along with Paul Sylvester, who owns Sweet and Range Jazz Club, which is still open today. Right? His mother was a McCarthy.
Oh, really?
Yeah, his great grandfather was Victor Eugene McCarthy, whose father was French-Irish and the mayor of New Orleans.
Really? I didn't know there was a McCarthy that was a mayor of New Orleans. I was really amazed to see there was a Haitian composer with the last name McCarthy.
That's it. That's Victor Eugene.
Oh, that's him. That's the guy.
Yeah. His father was Auguste McCarthy.
So how did you end up with the building? You just someone put it up for sale, or you stumbled?
It's so interesting. When as a teenager, teenagers think they're grown, and we can go into these nightclubs even though at the time we're not 18. Well, no one will find us, right? We'll just walk in very quietly and sneak a beer. On my way to visit my grandmother, who lived in Astoria as a 7 boy, driving along Claiborne Avenue, I'm passing by the building. I said, "Oh my God, they were double take, Cannon. It's boarded up." I said, "Oh my God, that's the old Negro Musicians Junior Hall." So I went to visit my grandmother. A week or so later, went to City Hall, did some research, got a name. So at the time, Judge Israel Augustine owned the building, who had died. But for my first marriage, his wife and my first wife were both school teachers. So, oh man, I know Helena. Called her up. I said, "Helena, what are you doing with that building on Claiborne and Columbus?" She said, "Alvin, take it off my hand. I don't it's abandoned. People breaking in. I said, "I'll buy it. How much you want?" She gave me a price. Spoke with Paul Sylvester. He said, "Okay, we'll go 50-50.
What year was that, Al?
1995. 95, 96.
So when you bought it, were you just buying it for, hey, this is an important building, we want to preserve it? Or did you know the treasures that were inside?
No idea what to find. But the idea was to rehab the building, restore it, and open the Jazz Museum on the site of the home of Louis Armstrong. He was a member of that union. All those guys, man, were belonging to the union. And needless to say, as fate would have it, that didn't happen. But we were able to extract all of the documents, which were just strewn all over the floor, and then some old desk drawers and a myriad of good information. So much that tells so many different stories about the history of people and venues in the city that no one would believe. And I was blessed. I was either crazy enough or foolish enough to relocate the documents on the West Bank of New Orleans. So when Hurricane Katrina struck, my property didn't flood.
Wow.
Otherwise, all that I'm speaking of would have been lost.
Oh my goodness.
And that's when I realized that there must have been a message for me in that music, because the city donated $50,000 to us through Preservation Resource Center. They kept the money. The contractor stopped working because we couldn't afford to pay him, and the building collapsed, almost like it imploded unto itself.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, well, that happened, yeah. But when I went to Algiers, the West Bank of New Orleans, and brought 2 of the big black garbage bags back full of papers. Recent the first contract I pulled out was Louis Armstrong, 1954, Biloxi, Mississippi. Like, oh my God, this is crazy stuff. So I'm looking and sifting through, and then I pull another contract, turn it over to see who the musicians were, because those old contracts would give you the venue and the dates and the amount agreed upon on the face, and the signature for the proprietor and the musician. On the backside would list the musicians. Turn this one over, and I'm reading the names of musicians, and I'm reading Richard Penniman, also known as Little Richard.
Wow.
Wow, wait a minute. So that night I called WWOZ, spoke with Neil, said, Neil, gave the date to him. He said, I'll call you back later. He called back later and said, that's a recording contract at the Dewdrop Inn. Little Richard, Tutti Frutti, Ready Teddy, and Rip It Up. I said, oh my God.
Wow.
Yeah,
So from the point of view of logistics, so you're a musician, you join the union, that gives you certain level of protection. I guess it gives you template documents that you can use when you're making a contract with a club owner or with a recording company, and then the union gets a copy of it so that it's on record.
The union perfects a contract. The musician gets a copy of it, because the union, local union, had to send a copy to New York, to 802, which was the American Federation of Musicians.
Oh, wow.
This was a real deal.
So the musician gets it, the local union has a copy, and then the national gets it.
Yeah.
Wow.
And any musician who refused to pay dues, they were reported. Any nightclub owner who refused to pay his musicians, he or she too were reported to the national union. And those guys are blacklisted. You cannot perform at this nightclub anymore.
Okay. And you earlier, way back, we were talking about the year 1941, and you mentioned there was a lot of interesting paperwork related to that year of other musicians coming from other parts to New Orleans, or?
There's a ledger about, maybe I would say maybe an inch and a quarter, inch and a half thick, that is dated pre-World War II, which meant that this whole ledger began in January 1941. And man, through 1940, 47 or 48, and to see the names in that ledger, from Dizzy to Gillespie to Ornette to Sonny Rollins to Billie Holiday to Ella to Sister Rosetta Tharpe to Louis Jordan.
Wow. So tell me the years again. So 41 to...
I went through like 47 or 48.
Wow. And so if you were a non-union member, but if you were not a local union member and you were coming from out of town, you'd get entered into the book so that you could play? Is that how that would work?
Yeah, because you have to pay a traveling tax. If you fail to pay your traveling tax, you could not perform in all these parishes.
Oh, okay. Okay. So I get paid by the club owner, and then I kick some of it up to the union.
Absolutely, pay your traveling tax.
Okay.
But before you could play, you had to show your union card that you were a paid up member in your own jurisdiction.
Okay.
If not, nobody. If you screw them, you're going to screw us.
Well, so that's so interesting. So that all these guys that we know, Louis Armstrong and Dizzy Gillespie, they were all members of a union somewhere.
Oh, a union, yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Could have been Buffalo, New York. Could have been Chicago. Could have been Mobile, Alabama. Could have been Baltimore, Maryland. Could have been out west in L.A.
And the unions had agreements with all the clubs and all the record producers.
Union scale.
Union scale. Everybody's heard that phrase, and now we know what it is. So that's sort of a minimum that you have to get paid.
Yeah. You didn't pay a scale. Can I work for you, buddy?
Okay. So you've got that ledger that shows basically all would it be just African-American musicians?
Yeah, because this was the Negro Musician Union.
Okay. So all of the then called Negro musicians,
yeah,
that came through New Orleans, that were doing it legitimately with their union card, and not sometimes people play without coming, reporting themselves, but generally those people that were doing it the regular way, their name would be in that book.
Absolutely.
So this would be a picture, a snapshot of the flow of outside musicians into New Orleans during that.
Musicians as well.
What's that?
And local musicians as well. Well, we cannot forget, Ken, that New Orleans, even today as we speak, I would still say is the epicenter of America's music. And a lot has changed, but not much has changed. Almost like ça pue, ça change, ça pue, ça reste. The more they contain, the more remain the same. This was a place to come to get musicians, to recruit musicians, eat good food, and have a great time. And it still is the same way. Nicholas Payton, Christian Scott, Trombone Shorty, the Marcellus kids, Blanchard, Ken Jordan, Kid Jordan's kid, Ken Jordan, his other son. We're still producing great musicians. And the guys with the big bands have always found a reason to come and pick these guys up, and they will become a part of their band.
Mm-hmm.
Duke had Bonnie Bigard. Jimmy Durante had Achille Baquet.
Was Jimmy Durante a New Orleanian?
No, but Achille Baquet was.
Ah.
Achille Baquet was an Afro Creole who passed for white. If you don't eat, you'll die. I just make that clear. So if you don't eat, you'll die. So you've got to work. And Jimmy Durante gave him a job. He relocated to Hoboken and then traveled across the river to New York. And he co-wrote Livery Stable Blues with Jimmy Durante.
Really? Okay.
Sir, and his great nephew owned Little Dizzy's restaurant, not far from me.
Oh, okay.
Wayne Baquet.
Okay. And then, of course, Earl Palmer, the New Orleanian, went out to Southern California and was the drummer for all the sessions, all the studio sessions.
Yeah, along with Chuck Beatty, bass player, Sam Cooke, Ray Charles. Chuck Beatty was on almost everybody's recording. Died in '97. These guys were in demand. Dizzy Gillespie, Lionel Hampton. Chuck was, if he were alive, he'd say, man, I was in the Philippines with Lionel Hampton.
And I know before we started the recording, I was telling you about somebody I just discovered named Mahmoud Chouki.
Choki, huh?
Choki. And he's a Moroccan fellow. And he said he originally came to visit New Orleans for 3 days. And then he ended up spending 3 weeks instead. And then he just moved, and he's been here for years. And he says the most beautiful thing, and let me see if I can find it. Because we talk about the people that came out of New Orleans, but we should also talk about the people who were influenced by New Orleans. And of course, some people aren't even aware of all the people influenced by New Orleans. One of them was Lester Young. In his biographies, he was a child in New Orleans, chasing after the parades and loving the parades. And then, of course, Ray Charles, got a big education at the Dewdrop Inn.
Let me throw a name out right quick so that we don't, and I don't want to forget it because his name is not mentioned enough. Born in Seattle, Washington, Robert Bumps Blackwell.
Oh,
Ray Charles was his pianist, and Quincy Jones was his trumpet player. He was a xylophonist, and Billie Holiday at the time fronted his band.
Oh, really?
He's the guy who co-wrote Long Tall Sally, Rip It Up with Little Richard.
Wow.
In New Orleans. Robert Bumps Blackwell.
So he's someone that came to New Orleans and was transformed.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And a little lady from Treme. The daughter still lives around it. His sister-in-law lives from my museum, 90 feet to the west of my museum. Since she's still alive.
Who's that?
Bumps Blackwell's sister-in-law.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Well, so here's what this fellow from Morocco says, and he's a master musician in his own right. He said, instead of staying 3 or 4 days, I ended up staying almost 3 weeks, and then I just moved back and stayed here forever. And here's what he said. He went back to Europe with his band, and he says, as soon as I started playing, everybody looked at me and said, "You've changed completely. I didn't see it actually, but I feel like when I moved to New Orleans, I removed a lot of chains. I became more free. I don't calculate my music as much. I grew up in a culture that calculated music, calculated notes, but here everything is free, everything is easy, the big easy. I gained confidence. I began writing music here. Musicians are amazing here. There's so much talent. I'm so happy to be here surrounded by these artists. Everything I write, it sounds beautiful. And that's because of the generosity and the love and dedication that the musicians have here. And he says, I'm not a jazz musician. I'm just the same. I'm still the Moroccan guy, but New Orleans transformed me.
Those are good statements. Those are good testimonies.
So now you'll have to add him to the museum.
Absolutely. Well,
Moroccan.
But I have the folk here from Tangier.
Okay.
And the music of the Ganawa people. The Ganawas and the Berbers. And the transition from the lute of the first piece and harpist that predates a lot of this, and the next cut transitions into Moroccan jazz.
Now you've been to Tangiers, right? Is that yeah. I haven't been there, but I've been to Marrakesh.
That's where my next stop was, to be Marrakesh.
Yeah. So they have a big public square with all kinds of acrobats and snake charmers and people selling food. Don't eat the food in the square. Careful. Unless you have a really strong stomach and have been on the road a long time. But they also have, this is so cool. Guys will come out, they'll bring like 5 folding chairs, they'll put them in a circle, they'll get in the middle and start playing. And then people come and sit in the chairs or stand around. And there may be 5 or 6 or 7 or 10 groups all spread out in the square. And they are jamming. These are really good musicians. They are smoking. I don't know if you saw that in Tangiers, but that's something that you can see in Marrakesh. And any one of these groups we could transport to New Orleans and they would be super popular overnight because they're just great musicians and they know how to have a party and play good music at the same time.
Tangier focus on the Ghana was playing the hand cymbals. The hand cymbals.
Oh yeah.
I was focused on the Ghana to show that correlation between the cazuelas or castanets of the flamenco dancers in Spain, and the point of origin, the hand cymbals from North Africa.
Yeah.
Guitar and the lute. The lute was first, the guitar was second. Yeah. The lute was first, the ukulele was second in Portugal. So my reason for going was, of course, enjoy myself. I love to research, but to connect those dots. So folks understand that there's a history to every instrument. And we need to look at it as such and not get stuck on the transatlantic slave trade, and that's all you speak about.
Right.
It's deeper than that. It goes back 3,000 years. Music and instruments and people.
Sure. And you if you ever get a chance to go to Marrakesh, let me know. I know somebody to hook you up with and a place to stay. It's really great. They have a great music museum down there too.
I'm waiting on to see just how badly the earthquake affected.
I know.
That was a big disappointment for me.
Yeah. It's and unfortunately the way people build there, there's no reinforced concrete. So if you get a good shake, things come right tumbling down,
Looks like an adobe wall or adobe building in Southwest. That adobe brick, it doesn't have any real substance, cannot withstand anything.
Yeah.
Nothing. It's unfortunate.
Hey, what other records do you have in the museum? So you have that book that shows everybody that came and went in the 1940s. You have a bunch of contracts.
Yeah.
Anything else that is sort of enlightening and will give people a better picture of how what was going on and continues to go on to this day, but especially what was going on back then?
Well, are we approaching the closing hour? And if so, I've got a juicy one for you.
Okay.
You ready?
Yeah, please.
Okay. We have to start today at Preservation Hall 2023. but not necessarily Preservation Hall, but the ownership, Ben Jaffe.
Okay.
So now we leave Ben on the side, at the sidebar. Now we want to go back in time to 1956. Musicians Union 802, New York City. Secretary Treasurer, Hyman, Hymn, Jaffe.
Oh, okay.
You see the connection now, right?
Okay.
Fast forward for 3 years, 1959. Excuse me. Ford Foundation bestows a grant upon Tulane University, 1959. That's 4 years before the lawsuit was filed by the NAACP to integrate Tulane University.
Okay.
Right? Keep it proper context. The Ford Foundation grants Tulane University so much money to Dr. William Ransom Hogan, chairman of the history department, and to become the Jazz Archives.
Oh.
1959.
Okay.
This letter was from the police chief that said, to all to whom it may concern, Richard Allen, who will become the first manager of 726 St. Peter, today known as Preservation Hall, and the first curator of Tulane's Hogan Jazz Archives, along with Bill Russell, violinist, photographer, were given permission to research, record musicians such as the Eureka Brass Band. And this is the letter reads, how the letter reads, that someone might want to hear the Eureka Brass Band in the year 2060 at a New Orleans funeral. Okay?
Okay.
That marked the beginning of what we know today as Preservation Hall.
Wow.
Alan Jaffe, after Richard Allen, would become the manager / and then the owner of Preservation Hall in late 1961. Remember, still segregated city.
Okay. So that's why he needed the letter from the police?
The police was telling everybody, black or white, they have my permission, don't molest them.
Gotcha.
They would be in the homes of Negroes and bars patronized exclusively by Negroes. Leave them alone. They have my permission to do the work.
Gotcha.
University.
Wow. Okay. Where's that letter?
The original letter is with my daughter, who does not live here. The copies I have with me here in New Orleans.
And that was one of the documents that you found in the Musicians Union? Yeah. Wow. Oh, my goodness.
Yeah. That's the real history. And of course, I met the young lady who now is the director of the Jazz Archives. And she said, oh yeah, they were trying to tell me something about the musicians gave the documents to them. I said, darling, no, they didn't. But I would never accuse anyone of pilfering because I wasn't there.
Right.
Just say, understand the time frame. We're speaking of the early 1960s when segregation was the law of the land.
So that's just one more gem of documentary history that you've preserved.
Yeah.
Wow. All right. Well, hey, I'm happy to say it's the longest interview I've ever done for Jazz on the Tube, and I'm glad we did it. We could talk forever.
But I would say I'm doing it because of who you are and what you do.
Oh, I appreciate that.
I'm being very honest with you. I remember having met you the first time and the second time. And whenever I get a hit from Jazz on the Tube, I immediately open. See, what are we doing today? Anyone who wants to know what's going on and what has been going on, Jazz on the Tube is the spot to do it. There's nothing like it.
Well, thank you. And we're recording this on the 19th, which is the day before my birthday.
My brother's birthday.
Oh, your brother's? Oh, okay. For two Virgos on the cusp of Libra. And your birthday's coming up soon, which is
October 4th, 19th, October the 4th of this year.
October the 4th. Okay.
12:07.
Was that?
12:07 p.m.
Oh, 12:07. Okay, good to know. For those astrologers out there. Great. Well, we're gonna run this on your birthday and let people know what you're about and this and I updated the book. I updated the book.
You told me about that.
Yeah. Did you get the new version? Did I send it to you? Not yet? Okay, good. I'm glad we talked because I'm going to send it to you. So in the new version, I tell people, because I in the book, I tell them about how confused I was, how lost I was the first time I visited New Orleans. I didn't know up from down and I missed everything, right? Which is what happens to everybody. And I said, well, that's good that I told them that story, but I have to give, I described the disease. I didn't give them the cure. So the cure is I give them 7 steps. First, wherever you are in the world, you could go on the internet and listen to WWOZ.
Yeah, that is so true.
Okay, just let that music just stream through you. Then you're going to hear of musicians that you never heard of before in your life, and you love them. Go to offbeat.com.
Yeah.
Right.
Jan is a wonderful woman. Jan Ramsey.
Jan Ramsey. Oh yeah. My God. Talk about, irreplaceable. It'd be hard to imagine New Orleans of the last 30 years without Offbeat and Jan.
Yeah.
Then, because food is so important, I say, look, read the reviews on Jan's on Offbeat, and then go to the other sites. Don't go to New Orleans and fail to eat well. If you do that, it's a terrible, terrible loss. Then I like this fellow. I don't know have you ever looked at his work? A Closer Walk, NOLA.com.
Yeah, he's called me a couple times.
Yeah, and I'll say that'll give you a map. And then I also like the city sightseeing bus. I know it's corny.
Hop on.
Yeah, because if you want to see Uptown and Magazine Street and you want to see the quarter, you better have a idea of what you're doing. So that bus will give you an idea if you get on it. And then my next piece of advice is you have to go to Tremé Petit Jazz Museum. You have to go. You have to be your first. That's the first specific non-vehicle, non-internet thing that I told him to do. You have to go there first. So that's how I updated the book. And I believe that. And I always knew that Al was doing great work. But then when I visited one day and he happened to be doing, I'll call it the show, it's a show. And it's always changing. I bet that show's never the same twice. Because you adapt it based on who's there. If they're from France, you tell them about the French connection. But when I had the opportunity to sit through pretty much the whole show, I'm like, wow, this is even better than I realized.
And to me, it's a pleasure. It really, really is.
Yeah. So everybody's, get my book. And then when you have my book, you'll have the instructions on what to do when you want to understand New Orleans better, how to prepare, and then what to do the first day you're there. And if the museum's open the day you're there, go to the museum.
Absolutely.
And Al will tell you places you can eat. He'll give you all kinds of your bags will be full of information, inspiration, insight. And it's not, I'm not going to say New Orleans is a very open and friendly town, but you're not going to find many people like Al who has this broad, huge vision of it, who is set up to convey that to you. So if you want to get off on the right foot on day one and realize fully the magical place you're in, you got to go to the museum. So Al, happy birthday, even though it's a little early.
Thank you. Appreciate that. And thank you for doing what you do as well.
And I may try to come down in October for some plantains, but we'll see.
Okay. Hey, we'll make it happen.
It's a motivation. It's a motivation.
Yeah, if the weather's a bit chilly in New York, why not come down to 75-degree weather?
Yeah, exactly. All right. Well, hey, thanks, and we'll talk again soon.
Take care. Thanks a million for all that you do. We appreciate it.
We hope you enjoyed the podcast. If you did, please share it. That's how we grow. And remember to subscribe to JazzOnTheTube.com, the internet's largest collection of free, streamable, classic jazz videos.